This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Right, we're going to begin with our afternoon and unfortunately final session of this very stimulating conference. And it's my pleasure to introduce Denis Walsh, Professor Denis Walsh, who I think is fair to say is one of the leading philosophers of biology. He's going to talk to us on hylomorphism, foundational materialism and emergence.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, Anne Sophie and John, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be involved in this conference. I was going to start with an apology, being Canadian, just to do that. That I'm not going to say anything about identity, but given the discussion just before lunch, maybe that's not necessary. I'm going to talk about, in very general terms, about a conception of what it is to be a living thing. Not which things are living things, but a conception of, given that something is a living thing, what sort of thing is it? And that's pretty vague, so let's start. So the general idea is this, that scientific theories or scientific domains have ontologies. There are things that they're about, or things that fall within the ambit of a particular scientific domain. And those ontologies embody or encode theories of being. Sciences of being qua being. They answer questions of what kinds of things there are, and what is it to be an entity such that it falls within the ambit of this domain of science. What it is to be the kind of thing each particular entity is, or maybe your science of being qua being will tell us something about the characteristic properties or activities of an entity. Okay. So these ontologies are very often kind of tacit. They're not made explicit, but they're not inert. They have empirical and theoretical consequences, and so it behooves us, whenever we can, to kind of make explicit the science of being qua being that's kind of folded into our scientific discourse or scientific theories. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the science of being qua being as it applies to organisms. So, as I said, these sciences of being qua being, these ontologies, are not inert. They have implications. And one of the common implications, one of the implications of these ontologies that runs, I think, through the history of biology is that certain theories of being may be inimical to or conducive to an understanding of living things. And there are various kinds of, in fact, throughout the history of biology, we can see this kind of tension between what philosophers and biologists think we should think about organisms and what our standard approaches to understanding things entail. So Dan Nicholson has recently given us a really nice account of the history of Organicism in 20th century biology. And that's a claim that the standard way of thinking of things doesn't apply appropriately to organisms. Organicism is an alternative ontology. Right? Likewise, substance vitalism is a claim that the standard way of thinking of things, entities, from, say, the 17th century until, say, the early 20th century, perhaps, isn't correct. We need some other way of thinking about living things, and substance vitalism was this alternative ontology. And evidently, there's another way of thinking of living things that involves a different kind of concept of being. This is process ontology, which I don't understand now, but I will by the end of the day. So, right. So I'm going to talk about two theories of being. One, an old-fashioned, completely outmoded, kind of potty one. And then, that's this one. And the other one is the one what we got now. Right? And I've discussed the two of them mostly as a foil, mostly as presenting hylomorphism, mostly as a way of contrasting it with this quite significantly different conception of what it is, or this considerably different theory of being qua being. So first I'm going to run through hylomorphism, what I take hylomorphism to entail, and then I'm going to say what I take foundationalist materialism to entail, which is the view of the nature of things that I think is encoded in much of our current scientific practices, and then I'm going to contrast them. Okay. And then I'm going to, does it say what I'm going to do? Yes. Then I'm going to raise a problem for the conception of organisms that arises out of foundational materialism. The general idea is that foundationalist materialism encounters certain difficulties in fulfilling the objectives of a science of science for a particularly salient class of natural beings, viz. Organisms. So foundationalist materialism is a bad ontology for the understanding of organisms. Okay, let's look at hylomorphism. So, hylomorphism, of course, is Aristotle's conception of the being of being, what it is to be an entity, right? And it's, according to Aristotle, a substance, an entity, is a composite of matter and form. It's not an ontological composite. The idea is that individuation, or the concept of a substance, for Aristotle is a kind of bifactorial thing. We haven't specified a particular substance or a thing until we've specified both its matter and its form. Okay, and so matter and form have a number of relations, right? Together they constitute what it is to be a thing, an entity, a substance. So there's a synchronic relation between matter and form, which you might think of as the relation as constitution. So form, at a time, form is that which is realized in matter, and matter is that which realizes form. That's very helpful. There's also a diachronic relation, which is matter and form offer us an account of coming to be. So form is a capacity of a substance, an entity, to bring about those determinate changes in its matter that realize the capacity that constitute that substance or entity. So now we're getting quite a bit clearer on what the relation of matter and form is. The matter and form have a modal relationship. So Aristotle often talks in terms of actuality and potentiality. I think the relationship goes something like this, that the nature of a substance is not permanent. So for instance, the matter of this table, say the wood, has the properties required of a table only potentially. It has the properties, the wood instantiates the properties required of a table only when it is informed as a table, when it takes the form of a table, and the form somehow makes the mere potentiality of these properties actual. And by the same token, the matter is the actualization of form in a particular table. There's for Aristotle, I think this is somewhere where a case in which I depart somewhat from Anne-Sophie and John's conception of Aristotle's notion of substance. For Aristotle, a substance is a dynamical phenomenon. So this is especially in the case of living things. So we're often told that Aristotle's ontology, Aristotle's metaphysics is specifically designed or expressly designed to give us an understanding of organisms. Right? So one of the features of this conception of things is that the substances are dynamical. Right? So in the case of living things, Aristotle says in their being is to live. What it is to be an organism, an entity, is to live. And living is an activity. And metaphysics say too, Aristotle says substance is on the one hand matter, that's part of it. On the other hand, it's form, and he goes on to give us a clarification of what form is. It is activity, or as he says, energia. So what does he mean by activity in this sense? Well, it's a process or action whose end is nothing other than itself. So what it is to be an organism, an entity, is to be a process or action that's fully there while it's occurring, right? A process that contains its own end and completion. And this idea of a process that's complete as it's happening, like say the process of running, there's no part of running that isn't there when you're running. This is the term Aristotle uses for this, is entity. Okay. So the principal kind of feature of hylomorphism is this kind of reciprocity between matter and form. It's a constitutive reciprocity. Something is a substance if it is an interaction in matter and form. And it's an explanatory reciprocity. Right? So an individual organism has the actual capacity to fill its way of life because of the properties of its matter. And the matter of an individual organism has the properties it has because of the organism's form. Sorry, I'm slipping into organism talk, but this is supposed to apply to all substances. Okay. So this means that the salient properties of complex entities, matter, are context-dependent, they're non-intrinsic, and they're conferred on that matter by the entity's form. Right? And by the same token, the capacity of a substance to undertake the activities that constitute its form are conferred on it by its matter. So you can explain the properties of the form of a particular substance by the way its matter permits it to conduct its characteristic activities, and you can explain why the matter has those particular properties by appeal to the form. So we have this constitutive and explanatory reciprocity between matter and form. There's according to Aristotle, there's a primacy of form over matter. So form is the capacity of a substance to bring about those determinate changes in matter that realizes the capacities that constitute the form. So form has a kind of explanatory primacy that matter doesn't have. The form is and Aristotle says in very many places, the form of a substance is the formal and sometimes the final and sometimes the efficient cause of its coming to be. Right? So form has an explanatory priority as well. Okay. And the relation between matter and form isn't objective and context insensitive, it's hierarchical or relative, right? So something could be matter with respect to some level of organization and form with respect to another. So for instance, the four elements are the matter of flesh and bone. Flesh and bone are the form that the four elements take in that particular configuration. And flesh and bone, for their part, are the matter of an organism. That's the stuff that an organism is made of. Flesh and bone have their particular form because of the organism of which they are the matter. So this idea of matter and form is not only reciprocal, but it's kind of non-level invariant, or level variance. So, okay. So here's more on matter and form. Roughly speaking, Jim Hankinson says, form is a restriction of matter, and this restriction relation can apply at a variety of different levels. At each level, we can intelligibly ask, what are the structural features of form, in virtue of which the stuff or thing is what it is at that level in question? And in what and out of what material substrate has that form been generated? You can tell that Jim Hankinson is a really good Aristotle scholar because he's started to write like Aristotle. Anyway, and Jim Lennox tells us about the form of an organism. The form of an organism is soul, or psyche. So Jim says, look, we might think of the form of an organism as a set of organizing principles, or a set of goal-directed dispositions to organize its matter in such a way that the organism is capable of performing the particular soul functions or life activities distinctive of its kind. Okay. So then, what it is to be a substance, for Aristotle, is to be this combination or interaction of matter and form. What it is to be an organism is to be a particular kind of substance, a kind of substance that's capable of marshalling the matter at its disposal in such a way that that matter enables that organism to perform a particular set of life functions, vital functions, or bios, as Aristotle calls the term. Okay. Contrast this. So, well, I mean, it's probably hardly surprising that hylomorphism fell out of favor as a scientific conception of the nature of being. It's pretty odd, for one thing, and it seems to kind of populate the world with uninstantiated forms and entities, and this kind of wild metaphysics fell out of favor around the time of the inception of the scientific revolution. Instead, we have a wholly different conception arising of what it is to be an entity, and this rises up to, I'll call this conception foundationalist materialism. I think it's kind of significant that it actually doesn't have a name. It's just like taken for granted. But this is the conception of what it is to be an entity that as I say, grew up around the beginning of the scientific revolution, associated with, well, there are French people there, so associated with people like Gassendi. But we're also in London, so it's associated with people like Boyle, right? Okay, so according to foundationalist materialism, matter isn't this relational thing. Matter is a thing itself. Matter is a substance. It has its own principles of individuation, principles of identity, and it's got its own intrinsic principles of change and stasis. Okay. So because matter is a substance, it gives us a different conception of the individuation of entities. Right? A substance, any kind of substance, any kind of thing, is just its matter. It's constituted of its matter, and in many cases it's considered to be identical to its matter. The reason is that because the matter determines the kind of thing and the nature of the thing that makes it up. Right? So the nature of a complex individual is determined exclusively by the properties of its constituent matter. And matter then has an explanatory primacy in this foundationalist materialism. Right? The properties of a complex individual can be accounted for exclusively by the properties of its matter. By properties, I mean the scientifically salient properties, the theoretically important ones. Okay. So here's a kind of chart, right? Is a comparison between our two sciences of being quality. Right? On the one hand, we have hylomorphism, and the other we have materialism, foundationalist materialism. And hylomorphism gives theoretical primacy to form, and whereas materialism gives theoretical primacy to matter. Matter construed differently, of course. The matter-form relation for hylomorphism is it's relational and reciprocal. What it is to be matter is a relational phenomenon. It's related to a particular substance. But the matter-form relation is foundational in materialism. What it is to be a thing is to be made up of a particular kind of matter. Right? So the relation between the whole and the constituent for hylomorphism is reciprocal as well. The form determines what its matter is, and the matter determines what its form is. The relationship between matter and a complex entity in foundational materialism is compositional. Complex things are just made up of matter, various aggregates of matter, various combinations of matter. Okay, and the properties of matter, according to these two views, according to hylomorphism, they're strictly contextual. What it is to be the matter of, say, this table is determined by the form that it realizes, by the form of the entity. But the properties of matter, according to foundational materialism, are intrinsic. Okay, so that's my contrast between these two theories of being, and as I said, this is the one that has taken over our conception of being that is kind of driving our usual scientific conception of the world. Okay. Now, foundational materialism has its own proprietary scientific method, and I'll call this an analytic mechanism. So Nancy Cartwright gives us a very nice account of what she takes to be this method. She calls it analysis, and she says, here's what you do. You want to understand what happens in the world and why the things happen and why the things in the world do what they do. To understand what happens in the world, she says, we take things apart into their fundamental pieces. To control the situation, we reassemble those pieces. We reorder them so they will work together to make things happen as we will. And you carry the pieces from place to place, assembling them together in new ways and in new contexts. This is completely continuous here, but I set this off for emphasis. But she says, but you always assume that they will try to behave in new arrangements as they have tried to behave in others. They will, in each case, act in accordance with their nature. So we can see how this analytic mechanism follows nicely from the kind of precepts of foundationalist materialism, right? So it has certain kind of assumptions which are consonant with foundationalism. So she says, here's how you understand stuff that goes on in the world. We take things apart into their fundamental pieces. So this means that ultimately the properties of all entities are grounded in the properties of the matter of which they are constituted. It also presupposes a kind of compositionality that's at least very congenial to foundational materialism. We want to make a new phenomenon, we want to reconstruct a phenomenon, we want to do another experiment. What we have to do is we have to put the pieces together in the same way. So we reassemble the pieces. And the reason of this is because whenever you reassemble the pieces in the same way, you get the same aggregate with the same properties, right? So this just reinforces the compositionality of the properties of matter. We see John Stuart Mill in A System of Logic saying, well, this is integral to our understanding of causes and causal structure and causal inference, because in order to do our causal inferences, we have to presuppose that cause is composed in a certain way, right? So he says, I shall give the name of the composition of causes to the principle which is exemplified in all cases in which the joint effect of several causes is identical with the sum of their effects. So which is to say, the joint effect at least is a function of the composition of the pieces reassembled. Okay. And he says this compositionality is pretty widespread. He kind of rescinds this later on, but he says there are no objects which do not, as to some of their phenomena, obey the principle of composition of causes, none that have not some laws which are rigidly fulfilled in every combination into which their objects enter. Okay. Nancy Cartwright's account of analysis also sort of embodies or nicely articulates this notion of intrinsicality. She says the reason we do this, method is because we're reasonably well assured that all the stuff we're dealing with will behave in a reliable way. Everything will, in each case, act in accordance with its nature, right? Which is its intrinsic capacity to undertake certain causal relations. Okay. So the explanatory properties of matter, at least explanatory theoretically important ones, are intrinsic, right? And so the properties of complex entities are determined by the intrinsic properties of their parts and the relations amongst those parts. And that's why, and then there's this kind of context and sensitivity of these properties as well. You always assume that they will try to behave in new arrangements as they have tried to behave in others, which is to say, no matter what the context, these parts, this matter, always has its particular intrinsic properties. Okay, so the properties of complex entities is simple. Okay. Now, the analytic method seems to entail something very important for us about the relations amongst causes, the relation of the causal properties of complex entities with respect to the causal properties of their parts. It's the causal inheritance principle. So I think the analytic method actually does entail causal inheritance. The causal inheritance principle, Jaguar Kim tells us, is that the causal properties of a complex entities are fixed by the properties of its parts, and their relations are fixed by the matter of which it's constituted. Okay. But there's a problem now with the causal inheritance principle, and it's this. Jaguar Kim has a number of arguments that attempt to show us that the causal inheritance principle makes the phenomenon of emergence incoherent. Okay? So this battery of arguments from Kim, actually there's a variety of arguments. I'm just going to concentrate on one version of it. So according to Kim, a complex entity cannot have causal properties that do not inhere in the properties of the part or the matter of which it is constituted. But the standard account of emergence is precisely this. Complex entities have causal powers that are not the causal powers of their opponents. Complex entities do stuff, do new things. They bring new phenomena into the world. And because of that, we have to treat they have emergent properties, and because of that, we have to treat complex entities as entities in their own right, not simply as aggregates or composites. So Kim attempts to tell us that this notion of emergence is incoherent. He says that emergence requires reflexive downward causation. And the argument goes something like this. Suppose we have some complex entity with property M1, and we know that this complex entity brings into causes, say, property M2. And then the microstate realizer of M1 is P1, and the microstate realizer of M2 is P2. Okay, so if we're emergentists, Kim says, then we have to think that M1 has a capacity to bring about M2 that P1 doesn't. But that's incoherent. Well, why is it incoherent? Well, it's incoherent because Kim says that would require what he calls reflexive downward causation. If M1 has the capacity to bring about M2, sorry, in the background there, but P1 doesn't, well then M1 would have to be able to confer on P1 the capacity to do so, because P1 brings about the microstate realizer. So M1 would have to be able to confer on this property, on P1 the capacity to bring about P2, because it doesn't already have it, because M1 is an emergent property. But where would M1 get that property from? Well, the only place that M1 could get that property from is from its microstate realizer, according to the causal inheritance principle. That's the only way, the only place it could get its property M1 from. So in that event, then P1 must already have those powers, which is to say, otherwise, by causal inheritance principle, M1 would not have them either. And so that means that reflexive downward causation entails then, together with causal inheritance, that P1 must both have and not have the capacity to bring about P2. And that's incoherent. Right? And so what we have here is a contradiction between an evidently well-supported metaphysical notion, the causal inheritance principle, that we seem to get straight out of the analytic method, and this other thing, reflexive downward causation. Right? And the two of them are inconsistent, and so one of them's got to go. The credentials of causal inheritance are unassailable, so reflexive downward causation has to go, right? So Kim says emergentism cannot live with reflexive downward causation, and it cannot live without it. Downward causation is the raison d'etre of emergence, but it may well turn out to be what, in the end, undermines it. Okay, so we're left with this problem of the incoherence of the very notion of emergence, given the causal inheritance principle, given the methodology that's appropriate to understanding complex entities. Okay. This is really unfortunate because I talked about people trying to make a special case for the category of organism being a special thing, and invariably when they do, they appeal to the idea that organisms have emergent properties. They are emergent entities. So Stephen Jay Gould very quaintly says, oh, organisms are just stuffed full of emergent properties. He's right. He doesn't give us an argument, but Immanuel Kant gives us an argument. He says, you just look at organisms and you see that it's not the case that the capacities of organisms are just simply vouchsafed by the matter that makes them up. It's not like that for organisms. there's this kind of causal and constitutive reciprocity that I mentioned earlier on. So Kant says, but an organism first processes the matter that it adds to itself into a specifically distinct quality, which the mechanism of nature outside of it cannot provide, and develops itself further by means of a material which in its composition is its own product. Right? So what he's saying here is that organisms are both causes and effects of the matter that makes them up. They're both cause and effects of themselves. And here is Mill here taking back this idea of causal composition. He says it just doesn't work for organisms, right? The capacities of an organism are just not an aggregative function of the capacities of their material parts. So he says it's certain that no mere summing up of the ingredients of a living body will ever amount to the action of the living body itself. And the British emergentist Alexander says, look, just look at an organism. You have to accept the existence of emerging properties, the capacity of organisms to mold and marshal and change their material constitution and the properties of their parts. So he says emergence is something we have to, in living things, is to be accepted with the natural piety of the investigator. It's just obvious. And so those people who argue for a particular conception of the nature of being that's applicable to organisms are all arguing that organisms are emergent entities, exhibit emergent phenomena. And the problem here seems to be that emergence is something we can't have. If Kim's argument is right, the causal inheritance principle just tells us that emergence is incoherent. Okay. So there are ways around this, of course, various ways of conceiving of emergence that are weaker, that are in very many ways consistent with Kim's stricture against strong emergence. And I've done some of this myself. I'm just going to move on because in a way they don't address the problem. The problem is that Kim tells us that the very thing we think constitutes organisms is incoherent. Right? So we need to address Kim's argument straight on. Now, Kim's argument is very often dismissed as a weak argument. And I think that's right, it is a weak argument, but there's something very, very important about its specific weakness. In what way is it weak? Well, so we're told that there's something about this relationship between CIP, causal inheritance principle, and a reflexive downward causation. Emergence requires both causal inheritance and reflexive downward causation. This seems to be right. The causal inheritance principle is inconsistent with reflexive downward causation. Only, this is the part that Kim doesn't tell us about, right? These two notions, causal inheritance and reflexive downward causation, are inconsistent with one another, only given a battery of further assumptions. So what are these further assumptions? Well, they're actually the assumptions that make up the concept of being that's constitutive of foundationalist materialism. They're foundationalism, compositionality, and intrinsicality. Okay. Now, I want to suggest then that reflexive downward causation and the causal inheritance principle can actually live side by side. They are consistent with one another. But they're inconsistent given these three assumptions. But given other assumptions about the nature of, say, a complex entity and the matter that makes it up, the nature of a substance and what it's made of, these two conceptions, these two principles, can be shown to be consistent. So my claim is that where the relevant capacities of the parts and matter are allowed to be, say, relational, reciprocal, and contextual, there's no incompatibility between causal inheritance principle and reflexive downward causation. You'll notice, given my color coding, that these are precepts of hylomorphism, of course. Right? So this needs an argument. right? They can be made consistent. Reflexive downward causation and causal inheritance can be made consistent. And I've noticed that one of the themes through all the wonderful talks is that at a crucial point in the talk, we get a picture of organisms. And this, I'm afraid, is the best I can do. Here are two organisms. And so here's I'm going to kind of give you a kind of analog of a new substance concept. I'll call it connubiality. There's a new kind of substance in town, a connubium, right? So Charles and Emma are married. So there's this complex entity, Charles Emma, and it exemplifies connubiality. It's a connubium. Now, what is it to be a connubium? What is it to have, for this complex entity, Charles Emma, to have the property of connubiality? Well, this property is inherited from the properties of the couple's parts. Right? I mean, the properties of the parts, the relevant parts being Charles and Emma. Okay? So, Emma and Charles, this dyadic entity, has the property of being a married couple. And this property is grounded in relevant properties of the parts. It's grounded in the property that Charles has of being married to Emma, and the property that Emma has of being married to Charles. Okay. Notice that these are not intrinsic properties, they're relational properties. But what grounds those properties? What grounds the property that Charles has of being married to Emma, and the property that Emma has being married to Charles? Well, the very fact that Charles and Emma are married. They're parts of a connubium. That's what makes it the case that Charles has the property of being married to Emma. Emma has the property of being married to Charles. So we have this reciprocity between the properties of the parts that constitute the whole, that make up the whole, and the property of the whole that confers on the parts those particularly relevant properties. It's not incoherent at all. So we have here something like an analog of the relationship between the causal inheritance principle and reflexive downward causation. So our analog of the causal inheritance principle is like this. Charles Emma instantiates connubiality in virtue of Charles being married to Emma and Emma being married to Charles. That's the causal inheritance principle. This is the upward determination of this property of connubiality by appeal to the parts. But we also have the analog of reflexive downward causation. What makes it the case that Emma is married to Charles? Emma is married to Charles in virtue of the property that Charles Emma has of being a married couple, in virtue of its connubiality. And so if that's right, where are these properties, the properties that constitute the substance, we might think of Emma and Charles as the matter of the substance, the connubium. When the properties that constitute the substance are relational and reciprocal, we have no inconsistency between the upward causation required by, which is to say the determination of the whole by the parts required by causal inheritance, and the downward determination, which is to say the determination of the relevant properties of the parts by the whole that we find in reflexive downward causation. So my claim then is that strong emergence is viable only if causal inheritance principle is consistent with reflexive downward causation. I'll take that much from Kim. But my claim is that these two principles are inconsistent given the precepts of materialist foundationalism, or foundationalist materialism, or whatever it is I'm calling that. These precepts are foundationalism, that the properties of complex entities are completely vouchsafed by the properties of the parts. Compositionality, what it is to be a complex entity, is just to be a collection of those, an aggregate of those parts, maybe in certain relations. And intrinsicality, the properties that confer on complex entities, complex substances, their properties are intrinsic to the parts. Okay? So we have this inconsistency between these two, between CIP and RDC, given the precepts of foundationalist materialism. Excellent. But given the precepts of our hylomorphism, the kind of reciprocity that we find in hylomorphism, these two principles are completely consistent. So CIP and RDC are consistent given hylomorphism, which is the relational nature of these relevant properties, the reciprocity that holds between form, matter, parts, and wholes, and the idea that the relevant properties that make it the case that the whole is the substance that is, are contextual, conferred on it by being in the context of being parts of that substance. So what we have then here is that it's not causal inheritance that's the problem for emergence. It's the science of being qua being that's encoded in our modern understanding of scientific methodology, or what it is to be an entity. Foundationalist materialism forecloses on the kind of constitutive explanatory reciprocity that hylomorphism allows. Okay, so some conclusions. The science of being qua being is not prior to scientific theories in general. It's not something that is inert. It's not something it's not something we start from. It's not something that is immune to revision. It's a part of the scientific theory itself. So the science of being qua being kind of gets thrown in the mix when we're testing or revising our theories against driving the evidence. So the science of being qua being itself is up for revision. It's revised, reformed along with the scientific theory in which it's embedded. Okay, so given that, then we can give ourselves an assessment of the concept of being qua being that's being instituted by the scientific revolution, and we can ask whether or not this conception of being qua being is adequate for our understanding of organisms, and it seems not to be. So foundational materialism fails to offer an understanding of the distinctive features of organisms. But there are other sciences of being qua being. There are other ontologies. So I'm not going to say one's better than the others, but I probably tipped my hand already. There's, for instance, hylomorphism. That might be a good one. Or we've got like substance vitalism. That might be a good one. It's a different way of thinking what it is to be an entity. We've evidently got this idea of processualism. I'm sure that's a good one, but I don't know what that is. So anyway, so we're not stuck with this foundational material. The methodology of the modern sciences is just kind of, it ill serves the project of understanding the nature of organisms qua natural entities. That's the end.